During the spring, we all have so many decisions that we have to make, literally almost thousands of them. The best way to streamline that is to be able to understand and use the tools that we have on our own farms to be able to make snap decisions just like that in a snap. Now, some of these are basic principles, but it sets us up for success. And the first one we'd like to talk about is saturated cold germ. Now, this is one that is becoming more and more prevalent. We always push it at every single one of our events because it is so important, and it's important for all of us to know. Now let's make sure that we understand what saturated cold germ is. It is the ability for the hybrid to be able to germinate under adverse conditions. And when I talk about adverse conditions, I'm talking about cold. I'm talking about cold, I'm talking about wet, I'm talking about just subpar in general. And let's not confuse this with what's on your seed bag. When you look at any seed bag, you'll see an SG percentage. That is your standard germination rate, and every seed company will put that on their bag. And what that is the hybrid's ability to germinate under optimum conditions. So notice the difference there. We talked about subpar and we talked about optimum. And that standard germination rate is also very important because it tells us how well our seed is going to do when we plant it at the right conditions. So you spend all this money on your planter, you get that perfect population, that perfect singulation and spacing, and when you put 34,000 plants seeds into the ground, you want to make sure that you're getting 34,000 back out when you plant them on a beautiful day with beautiful weather coming right after it. And saturated cold germ takes this just a step farther, and the best part about it is that it's testable. Greg and his team send their hybrids out to either the Midwest Labs or the Illinois Crop Improvement Association for testing every year, and they do 3 different tests. The first one is the saturated cold germ. The way that is done is they lay down a towel, a saturated towel, with a little bit of topsoil on top of it. They'll put the seeds into that topsoil and then put another saturated towel on top of it, making sure that all of those are completely saturated and not just moist, and that's what makes it different from just a standard cold test. That tray is placed into a temperature-controlled chamber for 7 days at 50 degrees. On the 8th day, it is then pulled out and warmed up to 73 to 75 degrees. After a couple of days, the amount of seeds that have germinated are counted. You have 100 seeds, 96 of them germinate, you have a 96% saturated cold germ test. The second test that is done is an accelerated aging test. What this tells you is how long your seed has been sitting on a shelf. Is it left over from last year? Is it even 2 years old? That should be put into a temperature-controlled chamber to preserve the seed and its vigor and its characteristics, but it's still nice to know, and while you're having the other test done, it's a great one to have done as well. The third test is a pericarp damage score, and what this tells you is how much damage or cracking there is in the seed coat on all of your hybrid. Why do we care about that? We care about that because if we're going to be using starter, we want to know if we can put starter right directly onto that seed or if we cannot. If there is a lot of damage to that seed, the salt from the starter is going to be brought into the seed and it is going to dry it out, and chances are you're going to end up with a lot poorer stand than what you were hoping for. These 3 tests together cost about $43 to have done. If you have 10 hybrids on your farm, it's about $430, and you will 100% remake that money by making better decisions on when to plant specific hybrids versus when not to. Even if you're not going to send your seed out for testing, we recommend that you save some of it and put it in a Ziploc bag. Go ahead and throw the tag off of the seed bag in there as well and throw it in your freezer, just in case you do end up wanting to come back and do some investigation later. Now, one other point is that when you look at your seed bag, some of them might have a saturated cold germ test on them, and that's a great thing. The issue is that there is not a standard way to do this test between different seed companies. So one seed company is going to do it very differently than another, and therefore you're not going to have an apples to apples comparison when you're trying to choose which hybrid to go with in the early spring. So that's why we recommend that you send all of your hybrids off at the same time, if you possibly can, to the same lab to make sure that you're getting a standard result. Greg on his farm this year had 14 different hybrids, and he sent them all out for testing. The results that he got on a saturated cold germ, the majority of those were in the 85 to 89% saturated cold germ. A few of those are in the 90 to 95 to 99%, and those are his rock stars, those are his Eskimos. He also had a few that were in the 60 to 65% range, and those are ones that you're going to want to hold back just a little bit until you know that you're going to have warmer temperatures. Now, we decided to take this just a step farther and decided to ground truth this. We have a plot laid out here, and Noel's going to take us through it.
This plot is split into 2 halves. We have a cold planted germination date on my left and a warm planted germination date on my right. The cold half of this plot was planted on April 13th, and the ground temperatures on April 13th were 56 degrees and continued to fall after planting. We actually received freezing soil temperatures after planting and we were burdened with a snowfall on April 14th. This seed was heavily burdened and stressed, especially in the first week after planting. In contrast, our warm planting germination date had a ground temperature of 62 degrees, and ground temperatures continued to climb after planting. Remember that 55 degrees is the magical number for seed germination to occur in the soil. So anything below 50 degrees, germination will not occur in the seed kernel. So in these two plots, we planted 3 identical hybrids at each planting date. All 3 of these hybrids were tested at the Illinois Crop Improvement Association, and during this testing we received the saturated cold germination test scores. Those scores were 44%, 67%, and 99% respectively. As we look at some of this corn staining in our plot today, I've got the 67% cold planting date on my left. Take a notice at the uneven ear height throughout this plot. We've got some late emergers that aren't going to produce an ear, and we've just got a lot of setback on these ears. It's going to cause a lot of problems for us throughout the growing season. This stand is going to be hard for us to manage, and it's going to be hard for us to capture all the sunlight as it comes down because we've got such uneven plant height. Now, as we step over here to the 67% warm germination, we've got very consistent ear height down the plot. Very even emergence occurred, and much more consistent leaf height and leaf structure throughout this stand. So in our 2 plots here today, each hybrid is represented by 1/1000th of an acre, and we have ear counts that I'm going to share with you today. So when we look at the cold planting date and how many ears we counted on that 1/1000th of an acre, the 44% had 24.5 ears, the 67% had 26 ears, and the 99% had 35 ears. Now, we planted both of these plots at a population of 35,000. So what that means is every seed we put in the ground of the 99% on April 13th came out of the ground and emerged. Now in contrast, over here on the warm side, our numbers start to improve. The 44% improves to 31 ears, 31.5 for the 67%, and 34 ears at the 99. We lost one along the way, but we're going to ignore that for today. So let's dive in a little closer to what these numbers mean. First off, I want to pull out these 67s. I feel like that's more relevant to what you might find as a lower saturated cold germ test result. Even though we have a 44 showing here today, we feel that this is a kind of an outliner, but it is a realistic hybrid that we ended up with this spring. To get a 99 is a phenomenal. If you have a 99 in the shop, you ought to hang on to him in case you want to start planting in early conditions. So let's look at the 67. I'll just circle him right here. Between our early and warm germination, our early and our later germinations, we had an ear count difference of 5.5 ears. Now we know that on 1/1000th of an acre, 1 ear equals 7 bushels. In this 67% hybrid, we lost 5.5 years between early and late planting. So to keep the math simple, let's just say 5 years. So if we lost 5 years times 7 bushels, that's 35 bushels an acre that we took off the top right there. We can't manage ourselves out of that later in the season. We lost that right at planting. So if corn's at $4 an acre, for example, and we're 35 bushels down, that's $140 an acre that we took off our bottom line. If you were trying to fight your way into planting in early April and you decided to take the 67% hybrid and stick 500 acres of it in the ground, what would that cost you? Well, let's do the math. 140 acres, $140 an acre times 500 acres, it's $70,000 of net loss for you. Whereas if you had just kept that in the shop and planted this 99, you could have saved that 67 for our later planting and gotten yourself a lot better stand count. So you might ask, what if we had planted the 99 instead of the 67% in April 13th? What would we have gained? So let's do the math. You can see right off the bat that we gained 9 ears. So we know that 9 ears times 7 bushels, that's 63 extra bushels an acre that we're putting in the grain wagon. So if we take that 63 bushels times $4 a bushel, we come out to $252 an acre of net gain. So if we were to have gone ahead and planted that 500 acres on April 13th, that would have been $126,000 improvement over planting your 67% hybrid. So at 360, as engineers, we're always trying to put the right people and the right seat on the bus in order to succeed. And you can do the same thing with your hybrids. You just have to be able to do the right tests in order to give yourself enough knowledge to make those decisions. We're not saying the 44% and the 67% are bad hybrids. They can still make decent yield for your farm, but you have to know where to play them and how to use them in order to have a successful crop. So we're going to go look at our sunlight utilization plot, and we have 4 different planting populations of 28,000, 42,000, 18,000, and 35,000. Each of these plots is split into 2 different row spacings of 20-inch and 30-inch, and we have 3 hybrids planted in each of those spacings.
So why are we talking about sunlight? Over here on my left, we have 42,000 plant population. We have 20-inch spacing from the sign back that way. We have 30-inch spacing from the sign and down that way. Over on my right, we have 18,000 plant population. Again, 20-inch spacing going that way, 30-inch spacing going that way. If you just look inside the rows, you can see the difference. We're shooting for 97% light interception. Over on the 42,000, we are definitely achieving that. Over on the 18,000, not so much. So what does sunlight do for us? Sunlight fuels photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, it allows the plant to add more sugars and starch during grain fill. What that does, it's going to give us a more dense kernel, which in turn is going to give us a higher yield. So light interception is also important for cooling the plant. If we look at our pictures back here, we have sunlight images. We have our 30-inch rows and our 20-inch rows. We have 42,000, 35,000, 28,000, and 18,000. As we go down, you can see there's more and more light that's hitting the ground. And then if we look over here at our thermal image, you see the same thing. There's more hot spots or hot zones as we get to the lower populations. We want as few as hot zones as possible, meaning we don't want any extra light hitting the ground. What that does is it just keeps it hotter in there, and it's going to make the plant work harder than it needs to. Another thing that light interception does is it helps with evapotranspiration. So evapotranspiration is the combination of evaporation and transpiration. Evaporation occurs from planting until V6. During that time, there's not a lot of leaf area, so the sun can shine directly on the ground, and then you have evaporation. Transpiration happens from V6 to R6. The sun is shining down on the leaves, photosynthesis occurs. When photosynthesis occurs, the pores on the bottom side of the leaves open up because it's pulling in carbon dioxide. But as the pores are open, it also allows water to seep out, and so we have evaporation that way, which is transpiration. It's hard to measure evapotranspiration. Typically, it's going to range anywhere from 0.04 to 0.4 inches per day. So there's different factors that determine that. One of them is being soil residue. Is there any residue that's protecting the soil from the sun shining directly on it, and so evaporation doesn't occur? Other things that can affect it are soil texture and also how much water is in the soil profile. Climate is also another thing that factors into how much evapotranspiration occurs. Is it a hot, sunny day like it is today, warm temperatures, and high humidity? So what do we need to consider when we're determining the correct plant population? We have so many different options, all the way from 18,000 up to 42,000. We have different row spacings. Whatever row spacing you're at is going to have a big impact on what population that you choose. Hybrid is something that you need to consider when we're looking at plant populations. If we look at these plants over here, we have different leaf structure. A lot of these will have vertical leaves that stick straight up. As we get down the plant, we have more floppy, horizontal, bigger leaves. So with this plant itself, the sun has a chance to shine directly down and get absorbed by the ear leaf and the bottom leaves as well. Every hybrid is going to be a little bit different. Some will have more vertical leaves, some will have more horizontal leaves. You just need to think about what your row spacing is going to be, what your population is going to be, and which structure of leaf is going to work best for you. Water holding capacity is something that you also need to consider. What type of soils do you have? Can you handle a 42,000 plant population, or do you need to go lower than that? If we look at the 42,000 plants again, you can see there's a lot of plants in this small area. And with this many plants, the soils that we have here are not able to sustain them. You can see they're starting to fire and starting to burn up. Basically, those plants are running out of water. Over here, if you look at our 18,000 population, you can see those look great. You know, there's definitely enough water in that soil to be able to sustain that low population. You know, most likely we're not going to plant that low of a population. Reed's going to talk about that here a little bit later in the session and go over some of the results that we're seeing here. If you are going to go with a high population, there are a lot of advantages to that. All of the things that we just talked about. Great light interception, good cooling, less evapotranspiration, good nutrient absorption or sunlight absorption. So all those things are advantages to planting at a high population. But there are some negatives as well. If you have that many plants in that small of an area, it's a breeding ground for disease. If we look over here again, you can see that gray leaf spot is very prevalent in these leaves over here. All of this out here was treated with the fungicide application, 12 ounces on July 24th. So you can see that there are halos around the gray leaf spot, so it did do its job, but there was a disease that was prevalent out here before they sprayed. So again, on the 42,000 population, it is very prevalent. You can easily see that on the leaves. On the 18,000 and on the other lower populations, we don't see it near as bad. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Reed, and he's going to bring you over to the 35,000 population area and talk to you about that.
Now, as we look at this 18,000 population, there are certain things that just scream at us right away when we take a look at it, right? The first one is that there is way more space around these plants than what there needs to be. They have way more nutrients and they have way more sunlight than what they need. And they show that to us by putting on what we call suckers or tillers, basically extra plants coming out of the original plant. Essentially, that plant is laying out on the sofa. It has all of the nitrogen, it has all of the sunlight, it has all of the nutrients that it will ever need, and it shows that to us by putting on extra plants around it. But let's not be fooled by that. Something like this is never going to help you out, right? Even if this puts anything on it, you would imagine that it will abort, and this will be a hot spot for disease. You also see quite a few double ears. Some of them are larger than others, but most of these are not going to come to anything either. These are never going to fill out into real kernels, and most of these will end up aborting, once again, giving you plenty of opportunity for disease. So looking at this, we can tell that we could have done with a much larger population. We could honestly have probably gone with almost twice the amount of seeds per acre, plants per acre, than what we actually have out here. And that's exactly what we have for you on the other side of this row. This here is a 35,000. Our sunlight is going away a little bit, but you can always still tell that this is going to have just about as much sunlight utilization as our 42,000 would on the other side of the block. What matters the most here is that we are getting the same sunlight utilization, but we're doing it at a lower population, right? We're doing it at a population that is sustainable for the soil. And that's the whole end goal that we're trying to shoot for here. We're trying to find a balance between population and hybrid and water holding capacity to be able to optimize our sunlight utilization. In this case, we have a fairly dark soil. We have a nice Ipava soil. It has decent water holding capacity. And so here in Central Illinois, you'll see us run a 30 to a 35,000 population. In this case, a 35,000. So what can we learn from this? What can we take away from this? I would encourage you to put out a population plot of your own, out on your own farm, because you're going to have your own different soils than what we have here in Central Illinois, and you know them better than anyone else. But corn is corn. Corn wants the same things and it will act the same way no matter where it is in the country or even in a different country. But the environment that it's in is what dictates how many plants we'll have and the different leaf structures and the different ears that we will put on it. Now, for example, if you have more dry soils, you have lower water holding capacity, it makes more sense for you to go to a lower population. You might be in that 25 to 28,000 population. But if you're going to do that, you want to have a leaf structure that is going to have a big floppy leaf. You want to be able to utilize all of the space around it. So if you're going to have more space between each one of your plants, you want to make sure that you're still utilizing all of that sunlight that's coming down in between that plant and the next plant. So you do that by putting on a big floppy leaf to maintain your leaf area index. To define leaf area index, is you're looking down from the top of the plant, almost like a Google Earth image, and you're quantifying the amount of green surface area on each of those plants compared to the amount of surface area on the soil below it. I'm not going to give you a magic number there, but what we like to say, per Ken Ferry, is that when you look down inside your corn row, you want to not see sunlight that is larger than a basketball. If you are, then you're seeing wasted energy. You're wasting energy and you're wasting sunlight, which is a lack of photosynthesis. On the flip side of our low water holding capacity example, we have a very high water holding capacity example. So you have very dark soils, you might even have irrigation on that. Here's where you boost up your populations. Here where you run your 40,000, your 42,000, and you're probably going to have a leaf structure very similar to what we have here. We have tall vertical leaves that allow the sunlight to drive down into the lower leaves where you have more of your big floppy ears down, or excuse me, your big floppy leaves down here to be able to capture that sunlight closer to the ear leaf. At the same time, we will probably put more of a determinate ear on here because we know that we're not going to stress this plant. We have the ability to spoon feed it water and nitrogen as it will need it, so we know that that corn is never going to have a bad day. So the point here is to play to your strengths. Play to the knowledge that you have about your own soils. You know pretty much what population you should be planting. If you don't, I very much so recommend you put out a population plot, and there's a lot you can learn there. Now we put out this population and hybrid plot out here to show the differences in the spacing and in the population and the sunlight utilization to be able to tell this story. And we have split that down to a single hybrid at each one of our populations, all four of our populations, 18, 28, 35, and 42,000, as well at both 20 and 30 inch spacing. And we have pulled ears and had them on an ear board to look at. When looking at this ear board, we have the 20 inch on the left and the 30 inch on the right. We start at 18,000 at the bottom, move up to 28,000, 35,000, and 42,000 at the top, doing the exact same thing on the right side. The first thing that we can notice here is that the 18,000 population and the 28,000 population ears tend to look a little bit better than the 35,000 and the 42. And that is what we would expect. At a lower population, each plant specifically has the ability to stretch out a little bit more and to gather a lot more sunlight, to be able to undergo photosynthesis and to be able to create those sugars and starches to then fill into that kernel. However, do not be fooled by the beautiful looking ears under the 18,000 population. Specifically on this soil type and these conditions, we know that we can support a 35,000 population hybrid. That being said, to be able to compete at the same yield level as the 35,000, the 18,000, at being almost half of the population as the 35, needs to have at least twice the kernel volume overall to be able to compete at the same yield level. And while they might look a little bit nicer here, we know that they are not going to come even close to being double the size of the 35,000 ears that are 2 rows above it. The second thing to look at on this ear board is the weight difference, the mass difference between the 20,000 on the left and the 30,000 on the right. Now on the 18,000, they look very, very similar. Actually, the 30 inch looks just a little bit better, and I think on that condition, it's more of the fact that there is just so much room around it that it doesn't really matter if you're in a 20 or a 30 inch. At that point, they can have all the sunlight and all the nutrients and all the water they could ever need. But if you see the trend with the rest of them, you notice that the 20 inch is always just a little bit heavier than the 30 inch, and there's a good reason for that. For example, if you look at 42,000 population on 20 inch, that gives you a nominal spacing of about 7.5, 7.4. If you take that over to a 30 inch, it was dropped to 4.9 inches nominal between plants. So essentially 7.5 inches versus 5 inches. So each one of those plants has just a little bit more room to spread out. They have a little bit more room to grow. They can capture a little bit more sunlight, and that is reflected in the different masses between the 20 and the 30 inch. But the biggest story on this board here is the difference in the yields. So if you look at the 18,000, you notice how very low they are, and they step up quite substantially when you go to the 28,000. However, when you get to the 35 and the difference between the 35 and the 42, there is no difference at all. What does that tell us? It tells us that we've already maxed out the sunlight utilization using the 35 population versus the 42. We know that on this soil we can't sustain a 42,000 population, and we're better off at a 35,000 population. Same thing with nutrient levels. We know that we have only so much, a finite amount in the bank, and we're already utilizing it all with a 35,000 population. There's no need to go to a 42,000 population here. So all we've done in this case is we've overspent by putting an extra 7,000 kernels in the ground. As you look at the population differences on this ear board, it is very evident how much sunlight utilization and therefore photosynthesis matters when we're talking about kernel fill. Let's take a look at just how big of a role each one of our leaves plays in that photosynthesis process. To be able to understand the differences between each one of these leaves, we did 4 tests. The first one here is we removed every single leaf except for the ear leaf, and then we have a control plant row in between. The next test, we reversed it. We took off only the ear leaf. Once again, there's a control in between. The third one, we removed the top 3 leaves from the top of the plant, as well as the ear leaf. And on the 4th test, we removed only the top 3 leaves. Now, why would we remove the top 3 leaves? This is to simulate aphid damage. If you come through with a late season fungicide pass, especially against gray leaf spot, what you're going to do is you're going to kill all the bacteria that will also kill aphids. If you do not include an insecticide in with that fungicide, you might find yourself with an aphid infestation, which will then coat the top 3 leaves with a gooey, gummy substance that renders them almost useless. We hope that you can use this information to help to set yourself up for success by helping your plants to harvest more sunlight. Now that we've had a chance to get all of the yield results from the plots that we put out this past summer, we'd like to share some of those results with you. First plot we want to look at is our saturated cold germ plot. So just as a quick reminder, the plot that we laid out had a 44% saturated cold germ rating, a 67% saturated cold germ rating, and a 99% saturated cold germ rating. Now we planted these on 2 different dates. The first date was April 13th of this past year, and the soil temperature was 56 degrees and the temperature above it was dropping, therefore the soil temperature would also be dropping. And the second date was on May 16th, where the soil was 62 degrees, but the temperature was rising, and we knew we were going to have a very nice week coming ahead of it, and knew we would have no problem being able to germinate. So this plot was planted at 35,000 plants per acre nominally. What we found when we went out and counted was the 44% cold, the April 13th date, was 24.5 thousand years. 44% warm on May 16th was at 31,000 years. 67% cold was at 26,000 years. 67% warm was at 31,500 years. 99% cold was at 35,000 years. And 99% warm was at 34,000 years. How do these stand counts relate to actual yield? We did kernel counts on all this, so we could share that with you. Between the 44% warm and the 44% cold, there was a 66 bushel loss. Between the 67% warm and 67% cold, there was a 37 bushel loss. And from the 99% warm to the 99% cold, there was only a 1 bushel loss. So what does this mean? Like we said in the Proving Ground session, none of these are bad hybrids. They're all very good hybrids. They're all around 250 plus in nominal conditions, which is very, very good. The difference here is when they were planted. And if you were to actually look at these ears, the difference is not in girth, it's not in length, and not even in kernel weight. It's in the fact that there are just less available ears in general to be able to be harvested, and that's the main takeaway here. The second plot we put in here was our sunlight utilization plot, and this was a very large plot that had 4 different populations, 3 different hybrids, and 20 and 30-inch spacing. Now the main point of this plot is to maximize the amount of sunlight that the Lord gives us without overtaxing our soils, our nutrient levels, and our water holding capacity, and not overpaying on seed. And also recognizing these facts to be able to use the right hybrid with the right leaf structure to play to the strengths that we have. So looking at the yield data here, you can see that there's a big difference, a big jump between the 18,000 and the 28,000. And then also from the 28,000 to the 35, there's a small jump. And then it starts to plateau a little bit as we move forward to the right between the 35,000 and the 42,000. And that makes sense. As we continue to bump up those populations, we're depleting the nutrient levels and the water holding capacity of the soil. So if we would have moved much more past the 42,000, I would expect that yield to have stayed the same, and it would have been a waste of seed. Now, this requires a basic understanding of your soil types, your nutrient levels, and your water holding capacity of your soil types. And you can use these to play to your strengths. If you have low water holding capacity and low nutrient levels, use a lower population, but if you're going to do that, use a plant that's going to spread out a little bit more. It's got big floppy leaves, that way it's still going to cover all that area and give you that better LAI, and you won't have those basketball-sized patches of sunlight on the ground. Alternatively, if you've got nice dark soils with high water holding capacity and great nutrient levels, you can bump up those populations into the high 30s, maybe even into the 40s. But when you do that, use more of an upright plant that's going to have upright leaves up at the top to be able to funnel that sunlight down with floppier leaves at the bottom to be able to still capture that sunlight and driving it down closer to the ear leaf. Now the third plot we put in place was our leaf removal plot, and this was just to simulate late season disease, pressure, and aphid damage. So what we did for this plot is after the R1 and silking stage, we went in and removed different leaves off of 4 rows in different configurations to test different symptoms. On the first row, we removed only the ear leaf. On the second row, we did the flip-flop. We removed all of the leaves except for the ear leaf. On the third row, we removed the top 3 leaves to simulate aphid damage. And on the fourth row, we removed the top 3 leaves and the ear leaf. And then we left a completely intact row in between each of those rows as a control. Now, in an effort not to waste corn, we only did this on about 20 feet of each row, so we weren't able to get good harvestable data from that. So I went out and I did kernel counts on each of these rows instead. So let's look at the results from this plot. When we just removed the ear leaf, we lost 7 bushel. When we removed all of the leaves except for that ear leaf, we lost 170 bushels. If you remove those leaves, the plant is no longer able to harvest enough sunlight energy to be able to pull up nutrients and water out of the ground to be able to pack those ears. When we removed just the top 3 leaves, we lost 70 bushels. And when we removed the top 3 and the ear leaf, we lost 50, which is a little bit of a nuance there. So when these leaves were cut off, the plants were already well past silking stage, so their rows around in girth were already set. But there are plenty of factors still to be considered that late in the season. From VT to R4 is where we see a lot of our late length. That's where the plant decides if it's going to tip back that ear or not. And then from R4 to R6 is where we get our depth and our kernel fill. And that's where it shows the difference between 70,000 and 90,000 kernels per bushel. So it's very important that we keep the plant healthy for as long as possible so it has the chance to fill those ears as well as it can. So if you look at the ears on the table, these are from this leaf removal plot. If you look at this first one here, this is where we removed all of the leaves except for the ear leaf. You can see how much it tipped back, and it's very, very small, especially in comparison to a control. Look at the girth there. The kernels are very, very small compared to the larger ones and the entire larger girth on that nicer looking ear. Even when we look at this ear, which is from the top 3 only removed in comparison to the control, these are both 18 round ears. They both would be very, very good. But look at the size and their diameters. That comes from the depth and the weight of the kernels on the control ear. This is probably a 75,000 kernel per bushel versus a 90,000 kernel per bushel. So throughout this whole video, we're trying to just drive home the need and the necessity to have a greater understanding of your entire farming operation. So it starts before planting, sending your seed out to get tested, to know the characteristics of each one of your hybrids and their lots, to know which seed to put in the ground when, to try to save yourself from those kind of rough decisions in the spring when it's cold and wet potentially, and then also doing soil testing, knowing your water levels, knowing your nutrient levels so that you can put the right population in the right hybrid in the right spot to ensure yourself a great yield. And once the crop is up and growing, continuously monitoring its health all the way through the season to ensure yourself good kernel fill and a great yield at the end of the season.